man who swam away from USSR and survived. Have you ever been thinking, what is freedom and free will mean for you? How much important is it for a happy life? We want to tell you an outstanding story about Stanislav Kurilov, who did an impossible and made his dreams come true. Stanislav Kurilov was born on July 17, 1936. He grew up in Semipalatinsk, now the city of Semi in Kazakhstan, where there are only endless steppes around. The first word little Slava said was the word voda, water. Kurilov himself describes it this way in his autobiographical book, Escape in the Ocean.
I remember a street in a small provincial town, a house and a room where I usually were sitting at a table and doing my homework. Outside the window, across the street, I was always looking at a high gray fence. I had to look at it every time I looked up from my books. I hated this gray fence, because it stood between me and that mysterious outside world. I were imagining big ocean waves, and as they rolled, they gradually carried it clean. In front of me, unknown distances opened up, quiet lagoons of tropical islands with palm trees on the shore, a lonely sailing ship far off the horizon, and the vast expanse of the ocean. But when I got tired of dreaming, and came to my senses, I again saw an inexorable gray fence in front of me.
In the summer camp, Slava learned to swim on his own. And at the age of 10, he swam across the river Irtysh, and barely escaped from the propeller of a ship that was passing by. At the age of 15, he fled to Leningrad, St. Petersburg nowadays, to get a job as a cabin boy in the Baltic Fleet. Of course, they didn't take him as a cabin boy, because he didn't have any documents. But Slava wasn't going to stop so easy. After he served in the army, Slava applied to the Leningrad Naval School. And when, due to vision problems, he was rejected by the selection committee, he entered the Hydrometeorological Institute and graduated with a degree in oceanography. After he worked as a hydrological engineer on Lake Baikal, lived in a hut. His duties were to collect information from 13 weather stations near the northern part of the lake. Kurilov said that the best part of this job was the possibility of complete solitude. On Baikal, Slava was practicing yoga for 12 hours a day, all free time he had. Then Kurilov, a young and promising specialist, was invited to Gelendzhik on the Black Sea, to the Chernomor Underwater Research Laboratory. Anatoly Mayer headed the laboratory. He taught a team of oceanographers how to survive in the sea. They lived for 2 weeks like half people, half fish, like aquanauts, at a depth of 30 meters. Most of the time they spent underwater. Slava spent more than 2,000 hours underwater. This is his recorded experience as a scuba diver. Mayer taught the guys how to act correctly in extreme situations. For example, when a storm began, they rushed to the shore right on the rocks in a tiny boat. One wrong decision, a second of delay, could cost a life. The research of Mayer's team attracted the attention of the famous oceanographer, Jacques Cousteau. He invited his Soviet colleagues from Chernomor to make a joint expedition across the Pacific Ocean to the shores of Tunisia. For the sake of this project, Slava graduated from long-distance navigation course. He has been training for 3 years. But because of intrigues at the Institute of Oceanology, Mayer and his team were refused to participate in the research. Soon, work with the underwater home ceased, and Mayer's group of divers was broken up. Slava's dream of a trip abroad also became illusory. In the USSR, to travel abroad, you needed not only a visa, an invitation from the country you wanted to visit, but also an exit visa, permission to leave the Soviet Union. Even before, Slava was applying for exit visa every 3 years, but every time he was refused. First, Kurilov's father was a prisoner during the Second World War, and USSR authorities those years were suspecting all prisoners of war as spies and traitors. Second, Kurilov's sister lived in a capitalist country. She married an Indian man, They met at college, and moved first to India and then to capitalistic Canada. And third, Stanislav himself was considered as unreliable, because he was studying English and practicing yoga. Strange hobbies for a Soviet comrade. Kurilov said that during the next visit to the visa center, he accidentally saw his personal file. It was stamped, "Visiting foreign countries is considered inappropriate."
I watched the ships of my dreams go over the horizon one by one. Everything that I was interested in, that I was pleasing in life, all this was stopped, dissolved, broken. This was some kind of serious crisis. I felt that my life had reached a dead end, and the prospects were bleakest.
However, on November 15, 1973, Zana, Slava's girlfriend, saw an ad in a newspaper. Readers were invited on a cruise on the liner called Soviet Union, from winter to summer, sailing to the equator through the Pacific Ocean and tropical seas. A tour on a cruise liner cost crazy money, 350 rubles, almost 3 salaries of a researcher at the institute. It was a huge amount. But Zana was worried about Slava's mental condition, so she found this money and sent him to this cruise. But she took his word that he would not commit any madness. Zana assumed that something like that could be expected from him. In December 1974, the tourist liner, Soviet Union, set off from Vladivostok to the equator. Its passengers didn't need any visa. The cruise ship was not going to enter foreign ports. All that was allowed to do for passengers was to admire the distant shores on the horizon, and to listen lectures about superiority of communism over capitalism in the evenings. On December 13, the weather changed. A storm was approaching. While the rest of the passengers were partying on the dance floor near the pool, Vyacheslav Kurilov went up to the upper, technical deck of the ship. He was standing there for a long time, peering at the horizon. Kurilov wasn't afraid of the impending storm, but, on the contrary, was going to use this advantage. Any other person in his place would have thought, maybe it's better to postpone the jump? But Slava, on the contrary, saw that the huge ocean waves give him an additional chance to save his neck when he hits the water. There were 14 meters from the upper deck to the water. A storm wave could add or subtract 6 meters in height. But Slava was not scared, but pleased. He was going to use the experience that he gained in the underwater research laboratory, Chernomor. 3 sailors were busy nearby. But then 2 of them left, and one turned his back on the passenger. The man realized that this was his chance. In 1 second, he jumped over the fence and dived into the night ocean. Jumping into the darkness, he thought that he would have to swim to the nearest island of the Philippines, only about 17 kilometers. At the same time, he did not have the opportunity to calmly study the route. He managed to see the map only briefly. He also didn't have a compass.
The liner was rapidly moving away. I felt a great relief. After all, I had just escaped alive and well from a terrible rotating propeller. And I finally fully realized that I was completely alone in the ocean. Help is nowhere to be found. And I have almost no chance of getting to the shore alive. At that moment, my mind sarcastically remarked, "But now you are completely free. Isn't that what you so passionately desired?"
As a result, the distance to the coast turned out to be almost twice longer. Moreover, the fugitive was drifted over the ocean. Slava had to swim to the coast about 100 kilometers. He spent 3 nights and 2 long days on this. He was saved not only by the fact that he was an excellent swimmer, but also by the fact that he was seriously interested in yoga. This also helped him concentrate and overcome himself and the ocean. In order to survive in the ocean, first of all, he had to conquer fear, and in order to remain conscious, he had to keep the rhythm of movements and breathing. He tried to follow the route by the stars. When Kurilov sailed to the Philippine island of Siargao, his body was covered with luminous plankton and glow blue. By the moment he found himself on land, he was over the moon. Fishermen saw him and reported to the authorities. Kurilov had neither documents nor money, so he was sent to prison, where illegal migrants and vagrants were kept. At first, Slava was suspected of spying for a Soviet Union. He was very seriously interrogated. Then he was transferred to Fort Bonifacio. There the head of the prison lieutenant colonel realized that Slava was no spy, just not this type of person. They became kind of friends. The lieutenant colonel even was taking him to local bars. He told, "Find relatives who will pay for you, and then we will release you." The only relative abroad was his sister Angela, but she still had to be found in Canada. The lieutenant colonel took the prisoner to the Canadian embassy, where they agreed to start searching for Angela and quickly found her. Sister acted as a guarantor and paid for the flight on the route Manila, Tokyo, Toronto. The Philippine Immigration and Deportation Commission issued Slava a funny certificate. It was confirming that there was the same Russian that local fishermen found on the shore of Siargao Island after he jumped from a Soviet ship. When Slava ended up in Canada with this piece of paper, the Ministry of Internal Affairs remembered him for a long time. And every time he came there, they smiled. "Well," they say, "this is the one that the fishermen found." When they learned at home that Slava had survived, he was sentenced in absentia to 10 years in prison for high treason. But to deprive him of his freedom will not work. Life in Canada was a clean state. He worked in a pizzeria, in a bakery. For $3 an hour he was cleaning the bottoms of ships in the port. But soon he was able to find a job in his specialty. He got a job in a private company that was selling diving equipment throughout America. It was far from wealth and prosperity. But Slava did not leave in order to become a rich man. For him, the main thing was to become a free man in a free country.
I lived my entire life in a country where everyone was always afraid of something. I saw the fear in their eyes, in their posture, in the way they spoke to each other, constantly listening and looking around. It's hard to believe that there are many healthy, strong men in the country, embraced by constant fear. It's hard to live among them.
In 1985, in Tel Aviv, Kurilov met journalist Elena Gendaleva. They got married. After he moved to Israel, and got a job at the Institute of Oceanography in Haifa. In January 1998, Slava participated in diving operations on the Lake Kinneret, freeing the equipment installed at the bottom from fishing nets. He got tangled in the nets and exhausted all the air. The dive in the Kinneret on January 29 was the last for Slava. That day he did not rise to the surface. The water gave him freedom, and 24 years later took his life. But we think that Slava Kurilov would agree with the fact that these 24 years were the most happy in his life.
Thank you for watching. This story can be an entertaining topic at the dinner table, because everybody enjoys to listen people with a good story. Share, like, subscribe. You know what to do. Leave us a comment what other topics you would discuss at the dinner table.